So before we get started, just give you an outline of the presentation. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about why sorghum, going to the different types of sorghum and how they're used, a little bit on the yield potential of sorghum, and then the main part of the presentation will focus on sorghum growth and development and hit those key growth stages. And then also, I will mention a few management tips that you need to be kind of aware of at those different growth stages. And then I'll finish up with just a very brief discussion on grazing stalks and then some key insects that you may need to be aware of in sorghum. Well, why sorghum? This is what sorghum certainly is famous for, as being a drought-tolerant crop. But I think what we fail to really emphasize and talk about very often is that sorghum does respond well to water. And I really think in a limited irrigated situation, I think sorghum can be a very good crop and something we need to probably concentrate and at least spend some more time thinking about as to how to use sorghum under limited irrigation. It also has a long planting window. In other words, you can plant it early, you can plant it late, change up your maturity class, and make sorghum. So for that reason, it can make a really good rotational crop, especially with soybeans or in the South with cotton. And actually, there's been some good research that has shown that even rotating with a corn crop, there's benefits to rotating to that corn the following year. Certainly with the resistant weeds, I think that's something else to consider, just putting another crop in the rotation, using some different chemicals and just some different methods of control can certainly help with that. I think it has a lower input cost than some of the other crops. And then again, one of the things it's kind of famous for is it does better on marginal soils and certainly has multi-purpose use. When we compare the input cost of sorghum and just compare it to corn, here's some numbers that just represents from the very beginning when you plant the crop. Usually there's some significant savings. And I think in a year where we do have low commodity prices, I think that is something to consider. But typically the range in just seed savings alone is anywhere from maybe $50 an acre to maybe as close as $100 an acre, depending on your particular seeding rate and maybe some of the traits that you're using in corn. But there can be some significant savings just from a seed cost standpoint. And I think that's something to keep in mind when you're comparing the two crops. I think regardless of the crop that you're considering, I think especially a year like this year where we've got low commodity prices pretty much just across the board, I think minimizing those seeding costs. So use the lowest seeding rate that you can get by with, regardless of the crop, to meet your particular yield goal. That can save you some money up front. Soil sampling and testing, certainly in the extension service, when I was with A&M, we were really pushing taking deep soil sampling or doing deep soil sampling, particularly looking for nitrates, particularly when you get into a drier environment where you don't have a lot of rain that's leaching the nitrogen out of the soil. You can have a significant amount of nitrogen down in the profile in that second, third, even fourth foot. And sorghum will certainly use that nitrogen from that deep. And so you can save some significant money just on nitrogen cost by spending a little bit of money up front and doing some deep soil sampling. If you're irrigating, you want to maximize that irrigation efficiency. When is the best time to apply that irrigation to sorghum? We'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. And then making sure your system is efficient. You don't want to be losing money or water use efficiency just from not having a system that's efficient. Go through that system, make sure you've got your spray nozzles, your nozzle tips are all working good, and you've got everything calibrated the way it should be to do a good job of irrigation. From a weed control standpoint, you certainly want to compare cost of herbicides. We talk a lot now about controlling resistant weeds and keeping those weeds from developing resistance. And sometimes I think a lot of weed scientists will tell you, and I'm a former weed scientist, that was my training at the University of Nebraska, is with resistant weeds, you just can't afford to have any escapes. And to some extent, that is true. But I think you also want to do a good job in just comparing the cost of different products. For example, if you're using a a bicep product for weed control as a pre-emergence. Are there some other options out there? Degree Extra comes to mind. Maybe mixing Outlook with atrazine. That tends to give you very similar to control to what bicep does. Now, maybe bicep is the best option, but just compare prices and see if you can save a couple dollars here and there. Then I also like to encourage people to be sure and check what adjuvants they're using and use what is recommended on the label, but use what is proven. There's a lot of people out selling various products that's going to give you extended control or better control, and just do your homework. Make sure those products will do what they say they're going to do before you spend that extra money. And then certainly insect control, we do want to be scouting and make sure if we do have insects, we get those under control. Well, the world of sorghum. Sorghum is a fun crop to work with because it is so diverse. It comes in basically all sizes and shapes. Grain sorghum that we're mostly familiar with, primarily used for feed, food, and ethanol. And then we have the forages. The forages, and again, depending on how you want to use it, might be depending on the use, silage, hay, or pasture will decide which particular hybrid or variety you're going to plant. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Biomass sorghum, sweet sorghum, something we really don't pay much attention to in the U.S., but it is a field that's beginning to grow, and I think there's some potential there, and you'll probably be hearing more about these crops in the future. Biomass sorghum, and this it's kind of a unique crop in that it can get up to 20 foot tall. This is actually me about 2 or 3 years ago at a field in North Carolina. I was actually working for a seed company at the time, and we were testing biomass sorghum. A lot of biomass there, obviously, and this potentially can be used just for combustion. That's what, for example, they do in Brazil. They just burn the biomass. Cellulosic ethanol. A lot of publicity a few years ago about using switchgrass for cellulosic ethanol. Well, biomass sorghum certainly could fit into that role. It's a very high tonnage crop, but it's poor quality. This is not something you're going to want to buy to feed to your cattle because it's just not what it's designed to do. Sweet sorghum, on the other hand, can actually be used as a feed source. In the U.S. currently, it's used mostly for molasses, but potentially it could be used for ethanol production. Basically, any place where you're growing sugar cane, you could grow sweet sorghum and basically process it just like you do the sugar cane. The sweet sorghum plant itself is going to have a higher juice volume, as you would expect. It's also going to have a higher sugar content. Some of you in Nebraska who may have grown sugar beets in the past, for example, kind of a similar principle. You want high yield, high biomass, but you've also got to have that juice volume, and then you want that sugar content to be high. The fact that it is high in sugar is really the reason it also can make a pretty good feed for cattle. Well, the sorghums that we're more familiar with are to the right here, grain sorghum, and that's what we'll spend most of the time today talking about. But the forage sorghums, growing interest really with forage sorghums throughout the Great Plains for as a silage or as a hay source. But basically, you have your sorghum Sudans, or sometimes these are called your hay grazers, or forage sorghums or cane that typically would be used more for silage or possibly for hay. There's various subclasses of these forage type grasses. They can be a BMR, they can be a brachytic, and what brachytic basically means, it means it just has a short internode, so it tends to be very leafy, but gives that stalk a little more strength where it doesn't lodge as much. A drier stalk, which can be of value. It can be male sterile, or you can have photoperiod sensitive types. Forage sorghum really can be used as a dual purpose crop, in that you potentially could, with certain varieties, go in and harvest the grain. And that is done in some instances. But typically a forage sorghum is going to be taller than your grain sorghum. Typically not going to produce as much grain, but some of these forage sorghums can produce a lot of grain under irrigation and can be very, very good, again, as a dual-purpose crop. And that's also important if the particular nutritionist is wanting a lot of starch in his ration. So you can kind of tailor-make or tailor-order your forage sorghum that you're planting depending on what that nutritionist is wanting. But typically they're going to be leafier, taller, and usually later in maturity than your grain sorghum hybrids. And really from a silage yield standpoint, the tonnage, again, depending on which hybrid you're choosing, can be very similar to corn, and in some cases the quality of that forage can be very good and right up there with corn, again, depending on the particular hybrid that you're planting. Sorghums that are used for hay and pasture, well, we think of Sudan grass. Sudan grass is going to have a higher leaf to stem ratio, smaller stem, so that typically makes it more palatable. Sudan grass has faster regrowth, so it works very good in a multi-cut situation for hay or in a grazing situation. And one advantage to Sudan grass, it has less prussic acid. It can give prussic acid, but not as likely or as high as what you would typically see in a forage sorghum. Now, I will say, in my opinion, the prussic acid risk to sorghum is a lot of times overblown, but it gives us agronomists something to talk about in the fall when we're not doing anything else, I guess, and write up articles. But really seldom you run into a prussic acid problem. It can happen, and so it's something you need to be aware of. But Sudan grass does have a less of a risk than what you would see with a grain sorghum or a forage sorghum. Your sorghum Sudan grass crosses, or typically called hay grazers a lot of times, they can come again in a lot of different shapes and sizes. They can have a sweet stalk or maybe not. They can look more like a Sudan grass or look more like a grain sorghum. Kind of depends on the cross and the particular hybrid. But they typically are used for grazing, for hay, or in some cases they are actually used for silage. The regrowth typically is not quite as good as what you would get with Sudan grass, but better than forage sorghum. Photoperiod sensitive sorghum. Actually, most of the germplasm or the sorghum in the world is photoperiod sensitive. Now in the U.S., we're not growing photoperiod sensitive sorghums as grain sorghums. And the reason for that is they would never flower in most regions of the U.S. When a sorghum is photoperiod sensitive, it remains in that vegetative state or stage until the day length gets less than 12 hours and 20 minutes. Now, where I live in Amarillo, Texas, that occurs roughly September the 14th. At that point, the plant is signaled and it goes into the reproductive state, and it's going to head out in 3 or 4 weeks. But typically, we'll get a freeze, and so we never actually see the sorghum hitting with the photoperiod sensitive sorghums. But the potential advantage to these photoperiod sensitive sorghums is they just stay in that vegetative state, and so they just keep growing and they don't head out. And so for that reason, you can get some very high tonnage with these photoperiod sensitive sorghums. They're also used for grazing in some cases, because you can, since they do stay in that vegetative state, you can get more days of grazing typically than you could get with a non-photoperiod sensitive sorghum. But you will see these sowed for various uses, but primarily as for grazing or for hay. Occasionally for silage, but the fact they do stay in that vegetative state, the stalk doesn't dry down very quickly, and so typically when you harvest that for silage, it might be 75% moisture, which is typically higher than you want it to be for good ensiling. Another trait that's important with the forage sorghums is the BMR or brown midrib trait. Just as the name implies, the sorghum truly does have a brown midrib. This can be more intense depending on the hybrid or less intense. But well, in addition to the leaf having the midrib, the stalk of that sorghum plant will also have a brown color. So especially if you split that stalk open and look at that pith, it'll definitely have a brown tint to it. Well, just because you have a brown midrib or brown pith doesn't mean a whole lot, but that trait is tied to higher digestibility. And so that's what makes it desirable from a forage standpoint. So really what's going on here, and the brown midrib can come in, it can be in a forage sorghum, it can be in a sorghum Sudan grass, or even in grain sorghum, but it has less lignin content in it. That's what's really the key. And so that in turn makes it more digestible and also increases the palatability. For example, if you have a forage sorghum that you're grazing that's a brown midrib and you've got a strip of it running through your pasture or your field, you turn cattle out there, they'll go to that brown midrib strip and eat that to the ground usually before they even touch the conventional sorghum that may be surrounding it. So the cattle certainly prefer it. The fact that you're taking the lignin out of that plant, though, does increase the potential for lodging. And so typically if you are growing a BMR forage sorghum, you do want to make sure you harvest it on time and don't leave it out in the field too long, or sometimes you can get more lodging. The particular picture that you're seeing here is actually a brown midrib brachytic sorghum. So you can see how these inner nodes are shorter and how leafy this material is. And that's kind of the newest forage sorghum, I guess, if you will, that's been on the market the last 4 or 5 years, and some of the seed companies are very much pushing the brachytic sorghums with the brown midrib trait. I thought I would just mention pearl millet. Millet is not in the sorghum family, but it's used in a lot of ways similar to sorghum for forage. Millet is a very leafy material before it heads out. For that reason, it's very palatable, and from a quality standpoint, usually it's quite good. Yield will not be usually as good as a sorghum Sudan, or especially a sorghum Sudan, sorghum Sudan cross, may be similar to a Sudan grass. And another big advantage to it, it has no prussic acid at all. So from a grazing standpoint, it's a really good choice for late planting, or if you are planning on grazing late into the season. Okay, focusing now on grain sorghum and kind of getting into more of the meat of the presentation here, I want to just mention to you the grain sorghum yield contest that the National Sorghum Growers sponsors every year. We've had a goal the last couple of years to reach 250 bushels, and we've gotten close. We've gotten very close to that 250, and certainly that will be achieved, I think, in the relatively near future. One thing I wanted to point out about this yield contest that was significant this year, if you look at 2016 and the green bar here, this was the national winners, and the third place national winner this last season was Ron Robinson, who is in Harlan County in Nebraska here. And just wanted to point that out, that he did an excellent job, grew 198 bushel sorghum. And I think what was even more impressive in my mind is he actually did that with a food grade sorghum. Most of the grain sorghum in the U.S. is used for feed grain, but very much a growing segment of our industry is sorghum for food. Because, well, for one, it's non-GMO, which is favored by certainly a portion of the public, and then it's gluten-free. And so those are kind of two of the big buzzwords that make sorghum a popular choice now to be used in food material. And Ron did this, the 198 bushel, with a food grade sorghum. Well, what goes into a food grade sorghum? Well, one, it has to be a white or cream colored grain. And then it also has to be a tan plant color. And you may ask, well, what are you talking about, a tan plant color? The importance of that is the glumes that are on the sorghum, you want those to be a tan color. You don't want them to have a purple or red color to them on the glumes that surrounds that grain, because that color can bleed. When it's harvested, you get some of those gleans, and it can bleed into the grain and the flour that's ultimately produced. And so you want the plant to be tan colored. Well, what is a tan colored plant? It looks green to me, right? Well, sorghum is either a tan or it's a red or purple color. And you know what color it is if it's wounded in some way. The other way you can tell what the color of the plant is by those glooms that I was talking about. So if you look at this particular sorghum head, not a really good picture, but we have the white colored grain, but the glooms are actually a red or purple color. And that's what we do not want in the food grade sorghum. So you want those glooms to be tan. The grain color itself can, as you know, can vary a lot in color. And what controls that grain color, there's really three things that are the main influencers on the grain color. The first is the seed coat itself, the bran color, and the thickness of that bran or that seed coat. And typically the coat itself can be either a red, white, or lemon yellow color, or it can be almost no color at all and be very thin. If that's the case, then the endosperm, which is either a white or yellow, will be the driving factor determining what color that grain is. You can also have a sublayer in there called the testa. And the reason this testa layer is important, it can also have a color to it. But in the U.S., practically none of the grain sorghum sold in the U.S., or very, very low percentage of it, has a testa. And the reason that is important is because the testa contains tannin. And the sorghum industry in the U.S. a number of years ago made the decision to get away from tannin sorghum for good reason, because tannin can lower the feeding value of the grain. And so there's very little tannin in sorghum, which means there's not, this testa layer is not there. There's also some genes that can intensify the color that can also make a difference on that actual color. This is taking that plant and just demonstrating the color differences. So you've got your sorghum stalk. In this case, it's got a plant disease, probably Fusarium or anthracnose. I'm not sure there, probably Fusarium. You see that red-purple color. That plant clearly is a red-purple plant. The one to the right, more of a tan color. Same thing with these leaf lesions. You either have a red color or you have more of a tan color. And so that's how you know what your plant color is. Again, you can look at those blooms also that surround that kernel and know what color your plant is. Let's discuss sorghum growth and development for a few minutes. One of the most important things is just to recognize the various structures of a sorghum plant. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to corn. You have your flag leaf, which is going to typically be a shorter leaf than the other leaves, and so that's fairly easy to identify because it is so short. The flag leaf, or all the leaves for that matter, are connected to a leaf sheath, and then the joint between the leaf sheath and the flag leaf, or any of the other leaves, is the collar. And that collar region is important because that's what we're going to count when we go counting leaves. Again, similar to corn from that respect. When the sorghum emerges from the whorl, it's pushed up through that whorl by what's called the peduncle, the final stalk of that sorghum, or the peduncle. Different sorghums, depending on the hybrid and depending on the environment, that peduncle can be fairly long or it can be fairly short. From a harvesting efficiency standpoint, you would like to choose a sorghum hybrid that has a long peduncle or good head exertion, because that just makes it easier to harvest, and you're not taking as much of the leaf material into the combine at harvest. And that is somewhat controlled by hybrids, but clearly also environment can play a role in that too. If you get stressed as that head is beginning to emerge from the whorl, that peduncle can be shorter than it normally would if you were in a good environment. So this is just a close-up, but this actually is a corn plant. I didn't have a good picture of a sorghum plant, but it's very similar. Besides the flag leaf being a shorter leaf, that first leaf, or the cotyledon leaf, is going to be very short and have a blunt tip to it. So as you're counting leaves, you always want to look at the bottom of that plant and see if you can find that cotyledon or first leaf. And you can recognize it because it'll be short and blunted. Now, after about the fifth leaf stage or so, you're going to lose that leaf. And then counting leaves becomes more difficult. May even lose the next leaf or two up from that. The nodal root system becomes very important. That's going to be the primary root system of the sorghum. The radicle, once it emerges, it doesn't produce near the lateral roots that you see with corn. So that's kind of one of the differences that you'll see with sorghum versus corn. Again, similar to corn, one of the key driving factors of how fast sorghum develops is heat units. But the formula for calculating heat units is going to differ from that of corn. Typically with corn, you're using a base of 50 degrees, and most people will use a maximum temperature of 86. With sorghum, we really don't use a daily maximum temperature, but it's not unusual. Well, a few people will actually cut it off at 100 degrees, but most of the time you don't see a daily maximum use. So it ends up just being the average daily temperature minus 60, and that will give you a certain number of heat units. And that will pretty much drive how quickly sorghum matures. Now, it's not quite as straightforward as it is with corn, and that has to do with day length and night temperatures. Even though the grain sorghums that we're growing for the most part are not photoperiod sensitive, day length still can affect sorghum. More, and some hybrids a little bit more so than others, but day length does play a role in that. And then I also think night temperatures can play a role in that. You're going to western Nebraska where you're getting cooler night temperatures. I think that certainly can affect how quickly that plant develops. But from a local environment standpoint, you can certainly use heat units to predict the growth stage that sorghum will be in. And that's helpful from a modeling standpoint with some of the researchers particularly. Okay, so we've decided to plant sorghum. Probably one of the first decisions you're going to make is hybrid selection. Well, the first thing that you want to make sure of is that sorghum is adapted to your region. Fortunately, the Nebraska Sorghum Association sponsors some variety trials that are done in Nebraska, and I think those are very helpful. Hopefully the seed companies are also testing some of their varieties in your region, but just make sure it's adapted to the region. Of course, everybody, the first thing you're going to look for is yield, and it must yield clearly in your particular environment, whether you're a dryland farmer or you're going to irrigate, maybe really push the yields. I think the next most important characteristic is standability. Sorghum does tend to lodge more than corn, but there's a lot of differences in hybrids, and there's various things that will affect the standability of that sorghum. But when you run into a year where you do have a lot of lodging, I would really encourage you to look at those university trials where they've done lodging ratings and see what stood up and what didn't. And I think that's an important characteristic. And then certainly days to maturity. Drought tolerance is also an important characteristic for the dryland farmer. And then insect and disease tolerance. Seed company representatives are going to be probably your best source of information most of the time on what variety you're going to plant. But I would not discount the university trials also, and take a look at those, and hopefully your company reps are entering those varieties, those most popular varieties in the university trials, so you can do some side-by-side comparisons. And if they're not, I would encourage you to encourage your seed rep to do that. And then I think a really good one is just talk to the good sorghum growers in your area. Find out what they're planting, what are they using, as well as some of their cultural practices to grow the sorghum. At the Sorghum Check-off webpage, we do try to maintain various university trial data, and you can certainly visit the Sorghum Check-off and maybe see what Kansas is doing with some of their varieties, as well as Nebraska and other states. When you're selecting a sorghum variety, one of the first things you're going to look at is that variety maturity. And it is important to note that the seed companies will vary a little bit in what they call, for example, medium early. the typical range for a medium to early is 58 to 63 days. But some sorghum companies will lean more towards the 58 and some more towards the 63. So just be aware of that. What I would certainly do is I wouldn't look so much at, okay, it's a medium early. I would look at that company's literature and see how many days to mid-bloom, and see if that's going to fit your particular situation. There are some very early maturing hybrids. There's not a lot of them in this class that are 50 days or even less. Those can produce a crop very quickly, and those are typically used for late planting, maybe after a wheat harvest, or in some cases planted early, and they're trying to outrun maybe a drought that they're being expected later in the season, or maybe try to outrun some insects. With sugarcane aphid, for example, that's been a big problem in some areas of Texas. We're now encouraging some early planting just to avoid sugarcane aphid. Planting date. With corn, typically people talk about planting corn at 50 degrees. With sorghum, the soil temperature needs to be warmer. The optimum soil temperature really is about 70 to 75 degrees. Most of the time, we're not going to wait that long before we plant sorghum. And my recommendation really is you can start planting sorghum anytime the soil temperatures at 4 inches gets in that 58 to 60 degree range, with a forecast of warm weather for the next 7 to 10 days. I think that's very important. You may be at 60 degrees, but if the forecast is for really cool weather for the next week, then I don't think it would be wise to plant that sorghum. I think in some cases you can push that planting date up to a soil temperature of 55 degrees. Again, particularly if you've got a good forecast for warm weather, I think that could be done. And then you could consider planting a hybrid that has some cold tolerance. Some of the seed companies will actually list that in their brochures of plants, or rate that as far as cold tolerance, or you can talk to them and maybe identify a few varieties that have what they consider cold tolerance. So that is something that you can consider doing. I do occasionally hear of people planting when soil temperatures at 52, 53 degrees. In my opinion, that's just too cold. Sorghum is just going to sit there. At 50 degrees, nothing is going on in that sorghum plant. And the longer that seed stays in the ground, the better potential for something bad to happen. And so I really encourage that soil temperature of 58 to 60, and if you have to, push it to 55, but be sure you've got a good hybrid that's hopefully has some good vigor and possibly one that has some cold tolerance. Just like other crops, when you plant sorghum, you want it to have a firm seed bed. Typically, I like to see about the seed planted about 1 to 2 inches deep. Probably about 1.5 inches is perfect, but a lot of times you're having to plant to moisture. My personal opinion, I like to have at least 1/4 of an inch of moisture above that seed when I plant it, especially in, say, a clay loam soil. If I'm planting in a sandy soil, really I might like to have 1/2 inch or more moisture above that seed. Crusting can certainly inhibit the ability of that plant to come up and emerge. It's small seeded, so it doesn't have a lot of push to it like corn would have. And so for that reason, you don't want to plant it too deep. And then you do need to be aware of your soil crusting. And occasionally, if your soil crust over and has a very thick crust, you may need to run over that with some kind of implement to break that up. Sorghum comes in a lot of different seed sizes. And what that means is if you buy a pound of grain sorghum, it can vary a lot in the number of seed that are in that pound. And it can vary from 12,000 to 18,000 or even more with the forage sorghums. So we really encourage you to plant based off seed number and not by pound. For example, if you're used to planting 4 pounds of seed, and you plant a variety that had, say, 13,500 seed per pound versus one that had close to 18,000 pounds of seed per pound, that's a big difference in seed number. And you need to be aware of that. So really encourage you, look on that seed tag, plant by seed number, not by the pound. When the sorghum plant first comes up, obviously it's that cotyledon leaf is the first thing you're going to see out of the ground. when that plant is in, just coming up like that, it actually is very sensitive to bad things happening. And the reason for that, there's not a lot of reserve in that seed. And so this is sort of this is one of the more important stages of that sorghum. And the reason you want to get that sorghum crop up and emerge quickly, so you do want to plant it under good growing conditions. I did want to point out, atrazine is a very common herbicide and a very effective herbicide that's used in sorghum. It can be used pre-plant or early post emergence. You don't want to put that atrazine on when that sorghum is just coming out of the ground. Now, once it gets up just a little bit, has one good leaf on it, it's perfectly safe to put atrazine on. But I have seen atrazine set sorghum back pretty significantly when it's just coming out of that ground. So just be aware of that. If you were planning on putting it on pre-emergence, just be sure that the sorghum is not coming up at the time of the application. Or if you're going to do an early post-emergence, just let it all get out of the ground good, then put your atrazine on. Okay, let's look at some of the key growth stages, again, of sorghum. And this is just the scale that is typically used to stage sorghum. And it goes from 0 to 9. Well, most of us, and especially me, is not going to remember. If you tell me, my sorghum's in stage 6, I may not know what you're talking about. But if you'll tell me it's in the flowering stage, okay, now I know what stage you're talking about, or boot, or flag leaf, or head initiation, or if you're counting the number of leaves early in the season. So these descriptive terms, to me, is by far the best way to stage sorghum. Now, there's a couple of key points or times in the life of that sorghum that are very, very important. The first one occurs about 30 days after emergence, and that's when that head, that grain sorghum head initiation begins, or some people will call it growing point differentiation. But at that point, for about a week, maybe a 2-week period right in here, is when the number of seed on that sorghum head is being determined. So that's very important. The next really critical time is about 2 weeks surrounding flowering, particularly from boot to flowering, is a very important time in determining what your final yield is going to be. And I'll make some more comments about that here in just a little. Well, when sorghum is in that vegetative stage, which is the period of time before that head initiation, so the first 30 days or so of that sorghum's life, it can stand a lot of abuse. Now, it's got to get out of the ground, but once it gets out of the ground, you can get a hail. It can withstand some pretty significant droughts, freeze, wind, insects. Various things can potentially harm that sorghum, make it look bad, but typically it's going to come right back. And so that's one of the advantages to sorghum, is it does stand a lot of abuse during that early vegetative state. Most of your post herbicides need to go on in that first 30 days. Once that head differentiates, or that grain starts to form, that's when you can get some blasted heads, or you can get tend to get more lodging of the sorghum, things like that, if that post herbicide is not applied prior to that point. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, you want to have your herbicide on before that point. Take a look at this plant on the slide. This plant is just come up. Hasn't been up probably maybe a week. And you can see that cotyledon leaf, short and blunt. This sorghum plant really is in the first or maybe the second leaf stage. You're just about seeing that collar. I think I would go ahead and call that second leaf stage, because that collar is present. But this sorghum is probably no more than 3 inches tall at this point, and it's in that second leaf stage. Here's the third leaf, and you can probably see the fourth leaf just beginning to come out of the whorl. This plant's a little bit further along, but not much. This plant is also probably in that in that second leaf stage. It's probably about 5 inches tall, but you got your first, second leaf, and almost the third leaf, but not quite, because because we don't have a collar. So that's what you want to look for early in the season when you're looking at sorghum and deciding maybe when to apply a herbicide, is what leaf stage is it in, and you can begin to count those. Now, something also that's going on with the sorghum plant about this time, once it comes out of the ground, within about 2 weeks, it's going to start tillering, if it's going to tiller. And tillering can be very important to sorghum, or in some cases it could be a detriment, but sorghum will tiller. And what favors tillering is sunny days and cool temperatures, okay? And then a plant density of fewer than 3 plants per foot of row will also tend to promote tillering. Now you can have, say, 4 or 5, even 6 plants per foot of row and get some tillering. But if those plants are really spread out, that's where you're going to see the tillering occur. There are some variety differences. Some people prefer sorghum that's going to really tiller. Others, personally like myself, would rather see a sorghum that didn't tiller much at all, so that I could control my number of heads out there based off my seeding rate. But there are and can be some advantages to tillering. This is an old study that was done in Kansas, but it makes a really good point. In this particular slide, what we've got is 4 different planting dates from early. This was done in Kansas, May 3rd, May 17th, June 6th, and June 29th. And then we had 3 seeding rates. And what they were targeting was a plant population of 30, 60, and 90,000 plants per acre. What I wanted to point out with this particular study, if you look at that May 3rd planting date, the yield was identical. It didn't matter if it was 30, 60, or 90,000. The yield was identical. But what changed was the amount of yield that was attributed to tillering. So, plant early, get a lot of tillering, yield is the same. Plant a little bit higher seeding rate, tillering goes down, but again, the yield the same, and then so on. So early planting certainly tends to promote more tillering. Because again, we've got cooler temperatures. Soil temperatures are cooler, and then you've got hopefully still have very good sunny days, but that cool temperature is what's driving that. You get a little bit later, plant May 17th. Now, in this particular study, we did see an advantage to planting with the higher seeding rate. And the reason for that is because the tillering is not playing near the row as it did on May 3rd. Okay, so again, planting later, soil temperatures are beginning to warm up, air temperatures are warming up, less tillering. June 6th, very little of the yield can be attributed to tillering. And that's kind of something abnormal right here, and I can't explain what's going on and why you actually had a little bit of tillering that contributed to yield at that high seeding rate, but you wouldn't normally expect that. So as you plant later in the season, you do need to be aware of your planting date and or your seeding rate, excuse me, and the fact that you're not going to have as much tillering. So, for example, if I'm planting June 15th, I'm probably going to plant a higher seeding rate than I would have back here in May 3rd, but I count on some tillering helping me out by producing hopefully more heads that are going to be out there that can be harvested. This is another example of that. This was a trial done in Texas, but in this particular case, the seeding rate was 32,000 and 64,000. This is over a 3-year period. You look at your actual plant population that you got from these different seeding rates, and then you look at the number of tillers per plant. Well, in each case, not surprisingly, lower seeding rate, more tillers per plant. And these are actual tillers that produce yield. They're not what I call a sucker tiller that's just out there and not producing a head. If you then look at the number of heads per harvest, that reflects this number of tillering. And so in 1986 in particular here, the seeding rate is much more, the number of heads that were harvested is much closer together than what you would have expected based off the seeding rate. And that's really the case with each year. again, you look at the yield. Didn't really matter. 32,000 or 64,000, yield was pretty much identical within the year, with that yield just being made up by tillering, or in some cases maybe the size of the head. This pounds of grain per head is something I wanted to point out. An average size sorghum head typically is going to have, or weigh, that grain in a typical head is going to be about a tenth, maybe 0.11, maybe 0.12 pounds. That's kind of the average. It's an average size grain sorghum head. When you look over here at this this first example, the amount of grain per head was almost 0.17. So a very large head, okay? And the yield was 5,000 pounds. We talk a lot about corn and having the ability to have a flex ear and vary its yield just on the flexing of that ear. Well, sorghum is the same way. That grain head can, if you will, flex. Now that's going to be determined very early on, again, in the lifespan of that sorghum, in that 30 to 40 day time period after planting or after it emerges, is when that head size and the number of grain per head is going to be determined. But I just wanted to point that out, that pounds of grain per head can make a big difference in your yield, and can contribute, greatly to what your final yield is, even if you don't necessarily have a lot of tillering. Now, in this particular case, we had good tillering, or fairly good tillering, but then we also had that good grain per head to give us that 5,000 pound yield. Well, as an agronomist, something that I think about often is the things that contribute to yield. And there's really three things that contribute to yield. That's one, seed per panicle. So again, that gets back to that head size and why that is so important. Panicle per acre, so just the number of heads that are going to be out there. And then seed weight. Under limited water or dry land cropping system, this seed per panicle becomes really important. And so this is one reason you want to keep your seeding rate down, okay? And you want to make sure that plant is not stressing, if at all possible, during that time that head is forming in that plant. Now, as you get into irrigated sorghum, the number of seed per panicle certainly is still important, but your panicle per acre becomes a bigger contributor to yield, as does the seed weight. And so at this point, seeding rate is going to play a bigger role. And then what happens to that sorghum late in the growing season when it's filling, when you're having that seed fill, is also going to be important for that final yield. So again, kind of getting back to our growth stages, if we look at this particular plant, we're further along now. This plant actually is in about the 6th leaf stage. So if you count leaves, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 collars showing, 6th leaf stage, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 inches at this point is about how tall it is. This is the point that you're going to have that head initiation forming, and that seed number is going to start forming. So that little immature head is right just above that crown area at this point, and probably just above the ground surface. That's where that growing point of that sorghum is, with that immature head sitting right above it. This shows that. This is that sorghum panicle beginning to form. You can see how the nodes are stacked on top of each other. This is what the stalk actually looks at if you dissect it. This plant, I'm going to guess, is probably closer to 7 to 8 leaf stage, because you can see some internodes beginning to elongate at this point. But the point again I want to make is that head is beginning to differentiate, and you're beginning to form that head, and ultimately the number of seed per head is going to be determined around that 30 to 35 day after emergence is when that's going to occur. And so you don't want that plant to stress at that point. Okay, so we've gotten through that initial stage. Plant came up good. We didn't stress the plant during that head initiation, and We spent about 3 weeks getting to the point that we're now at boot. Okay, so the boot stage is not really the reproductive phase. That doesn't really occur till flowering, but boot through heading, flowering also can be very important in that sorghum's life, and you don't want that sorghum plant to be stressing in this period. This is the number of days it takes to go from boot to heading to flowering to milk, soft dough, hard dough, and physiological maturity. And that's good to know this type of information, because it gives you an idea of when that sorghum is going to reach these various stages, and then when you can begin to plan on harvest. And flowering is certainly one of the key growth stages. The flag leaf stage occurs right before the boot stage, and it's going to be the last leaf that's visible. As we talked about earlier, it's going to be a shorter leaf. The sorghum plant doesn't stay in this flag leaf stage very long. You'll see that flag leaf just emerging. You can see the collar. It's a short leaf, so you know it's flag leaf. You know you're getting close to flowering at this point. You're going to be in the boot stage within really just 3 or 4 days, and then on into the to the flag leaf stage. The boot stage, flag leaf now is fully emerged. You see the collar, and the boot stage is reached when that sorghum head is just about to emerge. And so that head is wrapped in that flag leaf leaf sheath, and it'll be a bulge there or swelling that you can clearly see. Now that plant's going to go from boot stage to heading in just 3 to 5 days. It won't take it long at all before it's going to be heading. The sorghum is considered to be in the heading stage once that panicle becomes visible. So once you see just the tip of that panicle visible, that particular plant is now considered to be in the heading stage. Now, depending on the hybrid, the plant can go from heading to mid-bloom very quickly. Some sorghums, as soon as they get out of that leaf whirl, start flowering. Others, that peduncle will keep growing and it'll get a little bit longer, and then it'll start flowering. But once it heads out, you're within just, in all likelihood, 4 or 5 days from flowering. Now, the sorghum panicle itself could come in a lot of different sizes and shapes, and very open that you might see with your sorghum Sudans or your forage sorghums, to your grain sorghums, which can be a very open head in some cases, or it can be a compact or what we call a semi-compact head. Are there advantages to different heads? Some people will tell you, yes, there is. I don't personally see a big advantage one way or the other. I think it's just personal preference. Most of your grain sorghums are going to be a semi-compact head or possibly a compact head. Some people think that if it's more compact, you tend to hold more moisture in that head, and so late in the season you get a lot of rain, you might get some sprouting. Or in some cases, if you have, say, headworms or other insects in that head, they might be harder to control if you got a compact head. But most research that I've seen would suggest it really doesn't make much difference from an insect or a sprouting standpoint on whether or not that head is open or very compact. Okay, this particular head, again, it started blooming just as soon as that head emerged from that whirl in this particular case. The sorghum plant begins to bloom at the top and then works its way down. Okay, so you'll see the first blooms at the top of the head, and then it'll work its way down over a 3 to 5 day period. Is what you would typically see. When 50% of the plants in a field are at 50% bloom, then that field is considered to be in the 50% or mid-bloom period. This is a close-up of the head, just showing those the anthers and that flowering process. This particular head is at 50% bloom or in mid-bloom. So again, you can see those anthers that have come out and have shed pollen. Probably the next day, if you come out in the morning, you would see, the rest of this head beginning to bloom. But this is the mid-bloom period. Sorghum will typically take anywhere from about 3 days to 5 days for that entire head to bloom, depending on the weather. This particular head, you can see these anthers have now turned brown. That means it's no longer flowering. It's released all of its pollen. It's done its thing. It's pollinated. really all the way to the bottom of this plant. And those anthers, as soon as you have a little bit of a wind, they're going to fall off and blow away. After the flowering stage, we now enter the milk stage of that sorghum. And very quickly after you get past that flowering stage, you can begin to squeeze liquid out of that grain. So take it between your fingers, squeeze it very easily. It'll be at first almost a clear material, but it'll very quickly turn to a milky substance and gradually turn into a soft, starchy material as it gets and starts approaching the soft dough stage. But that milk stage will usually last about 7 to 10 days. This would be another period during that grain sorghum that you really don't want to stress much from lack of water. If you do get stressed at this point, what can often happen is some of these lower seed that were set later, they were the last to flower, will tend to abort. You can also have some various insects that can cause a lot of damage to that plant when it's in that milk stage. So the next stage is the soft dough stage. We recognize the soft dough stage when we can no longer squeeze any moisture out of that plant or out of that grain. So you squeeze that between your fingers. You can still squeeze it, but it's just going to be have a soft mealy material with no liquid. At that point, it's now in the soft dough stage. Still pretty important that you control insects at this point, but it's getting to the point that pretty soon that grain is going to be much more stable, and it's going to be much more difficult to damage it from, at least from insects. After the soft dough stage, we enter the hard dough stage. You'll hear this sometimes referred to as, well, my sorghum is now coloring. When that plant begins to color, it's usually entering into that hard dough stage. At this point, you certainly can't squeeze any moisture out of it, and when you squeeze that kernel, it's becoming very hard. At some point, you won't be able to squeeze it between your fingers, and then it's in that hard dough stage at that point. The plant is beginning to start drying down. It's starting to lose some moisture, but at this point, the grain itself is probably still close to 40% when it's at the beginning of that stage, and then when it finishes that point and getting close to physiological maturity, that moisture will drop to about 25 to 30%. Okay, physiological maturity. When is that crop finally finished? Not as easy to tell as it is with corn, but there is a similar principle here. And that's that a black layer is formed. So at the base of that kernel, what you want to look for is this black area at the base of the plant. Now, these two kernels actually both are at physiological maturity. This one has just completed the hard dough stage, and we know it's a physiological maturity because we do have this dark black spot. Okay, and so it's at, if you want to call it black layer, you can call it black layer, but it's at physiological maturity. That grain is now going to gradually start drying down and eventually get to the point that you're ready to harvest. I wanted to mention a little bit about lodging in sorghum. Talked about that, or mentioned it at least a little bit earlier, but certainly hybrids differ in their ability to just have good standability. This particular variety just flat 100% on the ground. The one next to it looks great. So again, there are hybrid differences, and that's something to pay attention to when you're picking a hybrid. Now here growers sometimes say, well, I don't want a tall hybrid because it's going to lodge on me. Actually, when you look at the data, the height of the sorghum makes very little difference. You saw that biomass sorghum that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation that was 20 foot tall, actually stands up very good. So height really doesn't play much of a role when it comes to lodging. There are some things that will contribute to lodging. We talked about hybrid selection, and certainly that's important, but just your population being too high. The higher the plant population, the more likelihood that you're going to run into a lodging issue. So another reason just to pay attention to your seeding rate and only plant the number of seed that you need for your particular yield goal. Too much nitrogen. Another reason to do those deep soil samples, do a good job in determining how much nitrogen you have in your soil, and that you're not applying too much fertilizer. Now, you want to apply enough. If you don't, that will certainly hamper yield, but just having too much nitrogen sometimes will lead to a lodging issue. Stalk rots. Typically when we see lodging in sorghum, it's because of fusarium or charcoal rot, which tends to be more prevalent when we have dry weather. Okay, so late in the season, you get into dry weather, you've got good yield potential. That tends to make the charcoal rot, fusarium worse. The plant begins to pull carbon actually out of that stalk in order to feed the grain, and that tends to weaken that plant. So sometimes when we have good yield potential, dry weather, we'll get more stalk rot, but we're also robbing that stalk from some of the carbon and things that it needs, and you'll get lodging. And then the other thing that certainly will contribute to lodging is if you have some hail damage, which again opens it up to the charcoal rot or fusarium. But the things that we can control, hybrid selection, too much nitrogen, to some extent stalk insect damage, and then population too high are some things we need to pay attention to with sorghum. Okay, in closing in my discussion of sorghum growth stages, I wanted to show you this particular slide. This is showing the water use curve for sorghum. This happens to be in Amarillo, Texas. I really think this water curve would look very similar for Nebraska, or really anywhere you're at in the U.S. The only differences would be this curve, the line could just be shifted up a little bit. In other words, the maximum water use with this particular slide on average is about 0.27 inches a day. If I were growing this sorghum in Arizona, it might be closer to 0.35 inches. But I think in Nebraska, it'd be somewhat similar, maybe a little bit less than what we're getting here in Amarillo. But a couple of things I wanted to point out. Again, not much water being used early in the season. You wouldn't expect it to. You then get into that panicle initiation. Again, that's when that number of seed per head is going to be determined. So you don't want that plant to stress right here. If the soil is dry and you can irrigate, you want to be irrigating at this point, or your fertilizer, you want to have most of your fertilizer on before 30 days, before you reach 30 days out from planting, because you don't want that plant to be in any stress. You get into this rapid period of growth. The next key stage, I think, is boot. A lot of research has shown if you're only going to water sorghum one time, this is the time to do it, right at boot. That'll give you the biggest bang for your buck as far as your irrigation water. Because you're right before that flowering stage, and hopefully if you put on enough water, that'll get you through the early grain field period and potentially give you your best chance for good yield. I was asked to make a couple of very quick comments about grazing sorghum stalks, so I'll do that just real quickly. This is actually some research from Nebraska where they were comparing corn to milo. And actually there's very little difference. If you look at the crude protein of the grain, very similar in the leaves, actually a little bit higher with the sorghum, with the stalk, not much difference there from a protein standpoint. From an energy value, the digestibility of the corn versus milo, again, very similar, very similar. So really, if you're used to grazing corn stalks, you should like sorghum just as well, if not even a little bit better than corn. Some similarities: the leaf and stalk stover are very similar in digestibility. Both of these crops are going to sustain mid to late gestation cows, at least for the first 50 days. And of course, that depends on your stocking rate, but you should at least get 50 days out of it. And do keep in mind, though, that those cattle are typically eating the best part of that sorghum or corn during the first part of that grazing period. So if you leave the cattle out there too long, then you may have an issue and may need to be supplementing them. But for the most part, both of those crops are going to do a good job and can support cows grazing that sorghum or corn. Some pros of grazing sorghum compared to corn. Well, one, the residue tends to just be a little bit higher off the ground. This really has to do with just how sorghum is harvested compared to corn. And for this reason, or because of that, if you have a lot of snow, then those stalks hopefully will be above that snow, and the cattle have something they can eat until that snow melts away. There is such a thing as brown midrib grain sorghum. And so for those of you who really may want to graze sorghum, and that's an important part of your operation, you could consider one of these BMR grain sorghums. Now the disadvantages of those, because it's a BMR, you may end up with more lodging. So I would sure ask the seed company about that. But when you're grazing a BMR grain sorghum stover, very similar to what you see with forage sorghums when you compare a conventional to a BMR, you just have better average daily gain compared to conventional. And so that certainly can be an important thing to keep in mind. And this really relates back to your forage sorghums, or if you just want to plant some sorghum Sudan for grazing, you will almost always get more daily gain with a BMR than you will a conventional. Okay, just a very brief discussion on some key insects. Don't have time to go really into any detail on this. Green bug, which was a big issue in sorghum for a number of years, really isn't much of an issue anymore. Most of the hybrids that are planted have good resistance to green bug. Yellow sugarcane aphid occasionally might be a problem. Would not really expect this to see this as an issue that needed to be sprayed in Nebraska, but you may need to be able to recognize it to tell it from sugarcane aphid. Really, the two insects that I think need to be mentioned for Nebraska are fall armyworm and corn earworm. The headworms, again, your corn earworm or fall armyworm, they can cause a lot of damage. And I really think this last year, headworms cost farmers in Kansas some significant yield. They were worried about the sugarcane aphid, and in some cases, you should have been thinking about headworm. You want to begin checking that sorghum for headworms really right after flowering. When it's in that milk stage and soft dough stage, start checking the sorghum. Look for the worms. Now, it's pretty easy to see if you got a worm when it's an inch long, but those little quarter-inch, half-inch worms are much more difficult to see. So the way you scout for these, you take you a paper bag, white bag, or a white bucket, and just shake that head into that white bucket, and you can count those little worms very easily. And typically, the threshold is 1 to 2 half-inch or larger worms per head is when you need to be treating. If they're less than half an inch long, your beneficials a lot of times will take those out, and they're not really eating that much grain. Once they get above a half inch, they start doing a lot more damage, and that's when you want to get them controlled at that point. Be on the lookout for these corn earworms and fall armyworms just prior to that head emerging. If you start seeing a lot of leaves that look like this, that look like just multiple hose that have been placed into that sorghum, that's that earworm or fall armyworm eating through that leaf when it's still in the whorl and causing those little small holes. Very seldom do you need to treat sorghum for foliar feeding like this. It takes a lot of larvae on a significant number of plants to really cause an economic damage. But if you're seeing this kind of damage, that should be a sign that you need to pay attention. And when that sorghum heads out, be on the lookout for those headworms being in the head. Just really quickly on some aphids in sorghum. In the news, we talk a lot about sugarcane aphid, and I just want you to be able to recognize that. I don't think sugarcane aphid is going to be much of an issue in Nebraska. It did reach the far northern part of Kansas in 2016, so it's getting close. I think if it enters Nebraska, it's going to be late in the season, so it shouldn't hurt your yield, but could possibly cause some harvesting issues. But what you want to look for with the aphid, you want to look for these little black tailpipes or cornicles on its back end. That's really the key. That's what sets it apart from the green bug and the yellow sugarcane aphid that it can sometimes be confused with. What you will see with the sugarcane aphid, it'll be on the bottom of the leaf. They'll form these colonies, usually around that midrib, and they'll multiply very quickly. But again, anticipating if it's an issue in Nebraska, it'll probably be late in the season, and when things are cooling off, so they're probably multiplying a lot slower than they maybe would have been in, say, Texas or Kansas in August. The sugarcane aphid will also produce this honeydew material. And so sometimes the first thing you may see is when you're walking your field is just some isolated plants that have this sticky honeydew on them. Can be one of the first signs that you'll actually see and know that you've got sugarcane aphid. Just quickly on the yellow sugarcane aphid so you can tell it apart. Again, it won't have those tailpipes or cornicles, but it typically affects the lower leaves and tends to turn them a yellow color because the yellow sugarcane aphid does inject a toxin. And don't think it'll be much of an issue in Nebraska, but I mostly just wanted you to be aware of the yellow sugarcane aphid because I know a few aphids were found in sorghum last year in Nebraska, and just be aware and make sure you're telling the two apart, the yellow sugarcane aphid versus the sugarcane. And with that, I will wrap it up, and I'll be glad to take any questions. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can reach me by phone or at my email address, or certainly visit our website where we do try to keep some current information on sorghum production on our site. But again, I'm the agronomist with the Sorghum Check-off. I'm here to help sorghum growers, so if I can be of any help to you, please let me know. Thank you.